Hey everyone, welcome back to Project Honesty, a podcast designed for young adults, by a young adult, to gain brutally honest, friend-like advice, as well as provide a platform for young adults to form opinions, color outside of the lines, take deep dives into current events, and most importantly, have fun. This is Project Honesty, navigating reality with real conversations and diverse opinions. Hey, I am so happy to be back for episode 11 of Project Honesty. We're getting into the third part of the Turtle Island Talk series today, which I'm really excited about. Now, this episode today is kind of a last-minute decision. I didn't necessarily have this in the plan when I started the Turtle Island Talk series, but here we are. We're doing it, so it's okay. Last episode, we talked about Indigenous children in foster care, residential schools, and government involvement with Indigenous families. And I noticed over the last two episodes, I forgot to point out what it means to be First Nation or Inuit, or just any Indigenous identity overall. And I wanted to go over the different Indigenous communities in Canada and their identities because I want to rid of the umbrella terms that have been used by colonial oppressors for centuries, and I want to recognize the diversity among Indigenous communities in Canada. And not only that, I want to go over land treaties and the pros and cons, as well as diversity among linguistics in Indigenous communities in Canada. So that's today's episode, and I'm so happy to be back recording. First, I want to start off with what the different Indigenous identities are in Canada. Now, I want to preface this by saying that I'm not an Indigenous person, so it's not my place to decide what Indigenous means or what Indigenous identities exist. Even though I'll be listing a few Indigenous identities on here, there are still so many more. And specifically, I'll be covering what it means to be Indigenous based on government outlines. So since 1982, the Canadian government has officially recognized 3 distinct Indigenous cultural groups. These groups are all protected under the Canadian Constitution and have been since 1982. The 3 groups are First Nations, Métis, and Inuit, but Inuit is also known as Inuktitut, so those are the 3 groups. For First Nations, their group holds the most reserve land out of all the reserves in Canada. And up until the 80s, First Nations people were most commonly referred to as Indian. Now, in my research for this episode, I found that there is still legislation that refers to First Nations people as Indian. And according to how the government justifies it, I think they said something along the lines of, oh, we can't change it, so it's just there. Which is a little bit confusing to me, seeing a government basically say, oh, well, we can't change something that we made, so we're just going to keep it as is a little bit sad to hear. In 1980, many chiefs from around Canada gathered in Ottawa, and that was the first time the term First Nations was actually used to declare a group of people. Before 1982, this group was referred to as the National Indian Brotherhood, and that name has since changed to become the Assembly of First Nations. This group gives a voice politically to First Nations people across Canada, and even though First Nations is a term that is specified in many pieces of legislation, it's still a very general term, and we'll get into a little bit more specifics later on. According to 2021 data taken by the Canadian government, over 1 million people in Canada identified as First Nations. Under the First Nations umbrella, First Nations people speak around 50 different languages across their 630 communities in Canada. That's a lot. And so that's where you kind of see that umbrella term come in, where First Nations is kind of a blanket statement for all of the diversity among First Nations people. The next community is Métis. Now, Métis is a very hard thing to define. Métis people are a mix of European and Indigenous ancestry. And Métis Nation is a general term to refer to European and Indigenous mixed people throughout Canada. Now, the term Métis and just the Métis identity in general is so complex There is a lot of sides, a lot of stories. We're going to get into the two main sides later. But first, the Métis Nation was originally formed in Western Canada during the 19th century and has remained a huge political movement. It advocates for Métis rights, and we're going to get into the origin of the Métis Nation in a second. The two sides of the Métis identity have to do with the Red River Colony and the Red River Settlement. We're going to get into that too. One of the Métis identities has ties to the Red River Settlement, and the other identity, side of the Métis identity does not have ties to the Red River or the Red River Settlement. There's a lot of articles on the Canadian Encyclopedia that explains these sides. They're very, very hard to explain, even though they're broken down into two sides. There is still not a clear definition for what it means to be Métis or a Métis person in Canada. Some of you may be wondering, well, what the hell is the Red River Settlement? Well, the Red River Settlement is a colony that was founded by the 5th Earl of Selkirk, Thomas Douglas, in Lower Manitoba along the Assiniboine River. This colony was a very multiracial society, a mix of Indigenous people, but also European settlers from Scotland and Ireland, and I think Britain too? Britain was everywhere, so let's just throw Britain in there too. The Red River Settlement was a site of the historical Red River Resistance that happened prior to Manitoba officially joining Canada. This uprising eventually led to the emergence of one of the best-known Métis political figures, Louis Riel. And overall, this was a place for Métis to set up their own provisional government and advocate for Métis rights within government. Now again, there's no clear definition for what it means to be Métis. There's very long explanations, so if you're looking for good articles to read about the two different sides of what it means to be Métis, I would recommend going to the Canadian Encyclopedia and look up Métis, and then I think it will give you direct links to those two articles. They're very good to read. They're just a lot. Now, the last distinct cultural group in Canada is Inuit. The Inuit people are the largest inhabitants of northern Canadian regions. They're also known as the Inuk people, and the Inuit community consists of over 70,000 Inuk people. Inuit homeland is referred to Inuit Nunavut, which stands for the land of water and ice. 69% of Inuit people live in the Inuit Nunavut. Over 40% of Inuit people are living in Nunavut, and the remaining live in a region of northern Quebec called Nunavik. Now, that's just the top 3 places that are known to have a large population density of Inuit people, but obviously they live everywhere. The 8 main ethnic groups that come with being Inuit are Labrador, Ungava, Aguluk, Baffin Island, Caribou, Nitsilic, Copper, and Western Arctic Inuit. Inuktitut is the main language with 5 different dialects within it. So we already have one language inside the big umbrella of what it means to be Indigenous. Along with that, we have 5 other dialects that come with one language. So already you can see, again, how this umbrella term really takes away the diversity from Indigenous communities. Inuk people have ties back to 400,000 years ago with the Arctic people of Siberia, Alaska, and Greenland. There's a map showing where the region where Inuit people originally came from. It's pretty cool to see the traveling, and it's almost like a sweeping motion across the upper portion of the world. I think it's pretty cool. So those are the 3 main cultural groups that are recognized and protected under the Canadian Constitution. Now I want to get into Indigenous regions and Indigenous identities within those regions. So we just went over what it means to be Indigenous based on what the Canadian government's going to tell you. But now we're going to see the places that Indigenous people have originated and the regions that have been outlined by Indigenous communities, but also the government. So there are 6 different regions within Canada, and these regions spread into the US. I think there's 3 of them that spread into the US, in like Alaska and stuff like that. The first region is the Arctic. With 40% of Canada's landmass, it holds around 150,000 people that live within the region, and half of those people are Indigenous. Within the Arctic region, there are 53 Indigenous communities. Next, we have the subarctic, which is a 5 million square kilometer zone that stretches all the way from the Maritimes all the way up to the Canadian tundra. In this region, you'll find Indigenous groups like the Dene, the Cree, and the Ojibwe, and it is one of the largest regions in Canada. It also boasts many resources for Indigenous people, mainly animals, because there's such diversity among the region that Indigenous people have a lot of animal resources to use. The next region is the Northwest Coast. It stretches along the coastline of British Columbia, the Yukon, and a little bit of Alaska. The Haida peoples, as well as the coastal Salish peoples, inhabit the Northwest Coast, but there's also many more communities, specifically Salish communities that live in that region. This area was settled a really long time ago, 14,000 years ago during the last ice age, and the geography in this is a lot of mountains and coastal inlets and fjords. Next, we have the Plateau region, which consists of a lot of mountains on the coast, but as well as the Rocky Mountains, and it stretches down into Oregon, Washington, and Montana. And the largest linguistic group in this region is the Dene, but the most common Indigenous groups within the Plateau region include the Shuswap, the Syilx, and the Kootenai, among many others. Next, we have the Plains region, which is another huge region. I think it's like second to the subarctic region. It extends from northern Alberta and it grows all the way down into Texas and New Mexico. It's a lot of grasslands, a lot of prairies, a little bit of forest, but mostly prairies, hence the name Plains. And some of the Indigenous nations that can be found in this region include the Siksika, the Cree, the Ojibwe, the Nakota, and the Dakota. And the last region that we have in Canada is called the Eastern Woodlands, but it's also known as the Northeast region. This region starts from the lower western parts of the Great Lakes into lower eastern Canada and the Maritimes, so Nova Scotia, and I think a little bit of Labrador, but not that much. Some of the Indigenous groups in this region include the Haudenosaunee, the Mi'kmaq, Ojibwe, and the Huron people. And it's home to many Iroquois and Algonquin languages. The geography in this region ranges from thick coniferous forests to coastal environments. When talking about linguistics, not only in these regions, but in North America, prior to settler contact and colonialization, there was more than 450 Indigenous languages that were believed to be spoken in Canada and the United States. Now, in Canada, there are only a mere 70 Indigenous languages still being spoken. That's not that much compared to the 450 we had many, many years ago. When it comes to treaties were made so that it made the government's job easier when it came to categorizing Indigenous people. Now, yes, treaties did allot vast amounts of land for Indigenous communities. But the problem is, many treaty agreements were not explained before being signed, which made it difficult for Indigenous communities to realize what they were entitled to, which left a lot of communities in the dark. So why is it important to bring up the regions and linguistics and treaties as well as Indigenous identities? Well, starting all the way back at the beginning of colonization, when Christopher Columbus first arrived in the Caribbean, languages and cultural practices have been wiped and Indigenous people have been assimilated to fit into colonial ideals. It's important to push past these government boxes and recognize the real diversity among Indigenous communities. As we explored in this episode, there is so many languages that have been lost due to this colonization and the loss of language and the assimilation among Indigenous communities that prevents the spread of language and the teaching of languages. And so it's important to have a clear understanding of these Indigenous identities and territories, as it's an important step in moving forward with reconciliation. conversation. This was a shorter episode, but I think it was important to mention all of the things that I talked about today, just to give you guys a better idea of what I mean when I say First Nations on a podcast or when I say Inuit on a podcast. I wanted everybody to have an understanding of what that actually means. Thank you so much for listening to another episode of Project Honesty. You can find Project Honesty on Spotify at Project Honesty or on YouTube at Project_Honesty. And to keep up to date with new episodes, you can head over to Project Honesty's Instagram, which is at Project_Honesty24. We also have a TikTok. It's at Project.Honesty. To help spread this podcast everywhere, tell a friend or share with family about Project Honesty, and you can direct them over to the Instagram, the TikTok, Spotify, or YouTube to help them learn more. The more listeners, the bigger the family. Thanks. Bye-bye.